Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Steve Orlins, president of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, and today is really a day I've been looking forward to. It's one of my great honors and privileges of being president of the United States that I get to spend time with people like Admiral Davidson. I guess I've known the last 6 PACOM commanders and have gotten to spend time speaking with them about China. And what's consistent about every single one of them is it's the best and the brightest of America. And Admiral Davidson fits right into that, being the best and the brightest of America. If I went over his whole bio, we wouldn't have time for 1 minute of questions. So let me just jump right into it. You're about to give a talk to the members of the National Committee on U.S. China Relations, which is going to be a longer talk than this podcast. Can you give me the highlights, a 2-3 minute summary?
Yeah, sure, Steve. Thank you. And thank you for having me here today. I appreciate it very much. We're, of course, going to talk about the competition with China, which in my view represents the long-term strategic threat to the United States and the rules-based international order. And we'll talk a little bit about what they're doing in the diplomatic realm, the information realm, the military realm, the economic realm, how they're moving about the Indo-Pacific to begin with, but their global reach as well. We'll talk a little bit about the complexities of the relationship, how the countries in the region are viewing it, and the pressure that's been put on them by Chinese activities in the diplomatic, information, and economic realms specifically, to try to get them to choose between economic partnership with China or a security relationship with the United States.
Interesting. Let's start with, so your speech covers all of those. I mean, I remember one of your predecessors was asked, what did he think was likely to be the greatest threat to security in what was then the Asia-Pacific. We didn't call it Indo-Pacific then. That was only when you became commander. Mm-hmm. And he said, climate change will cripple the security environment, probably more likely than the other scenarios we all often talk about. Mm-hmm. Where does climate change fit in kind of your view of the threats to the Pacific?
Yeah, well, I frequently talk about the 5 threats that are of concerns to me. The effects from climate change are clearly one of them. It's no secret that last year, Indo-PACOM, our components, service headquarters that work for us, spent considerable amount of time with active duty soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines and Coast Guardsmen on the islands of Saipan and Tinian, which suffered from a 500-year storm last year. And wherever I go and I meet with political and military leaders, particularly across the Pacific Island chain, they can highlight for me and from their personal experience over the course of their lifetime, the changes that they're seeing in their island environments from childhood to this day and age. I think it's important to note along this path, I think climate change is an area in which we should be cooperating in those discussions.
How do the trade talks, which are going to resume next week in Washington, how do they fit into kind of your views of what's going on in the Asia-Pacific?
Well, I think one of the things we should really focus on is the changes in China in the wake of the economic lift that they've benefited from over the course of the last 40 years. At the beginning, all the advantages that the WTO could have, that would have accrued to China, worked quite effectively. Now China is the 2nd largest economy on the planet. They're in a much different place than the poor nation that they were. Many of those rules need to change.
In the talk and in your testimony, you talk about 70 years of peace in Asia. I guess I first arrived in Asia in 1972, and it was not a time of peace. And you talk about how the values and kind of the U.S.-led order led to a peaceful 70 years. I see it as a peaceful 40 years, and I date it from the establishment of diplomatic relations. How does kind of Vietnam and Korea kind of figure in that concept of 70 years of peace?
Yeah, I'd say worded quite differently than that, Steve. I mean, looking all the way back to World War II and including Vietnam and Korea, the United States was there in the region not to conquer others, but to liberate those countries from authoritarianism. That is a set of values that the United States has long beheld from our inception and signing of the Constitution. And it's something that competes extraordinarily well across the whole of the Indo-Pacific. I routinely hear from all of our allies and partners across the region how welcome we are, and it's because of our values in the United States.
It wasn't a peaceful time, though. That the Korean War and the Vietnam War, many of that, you were a little later at the Naval Academy. Certainly some of my classmates died in the Vietnam War, none in the Korean War. I was way too young. So really, wasn't it the establishment of diplomatic relations with China and our ability to kind of talk to the Chinese that has in part led to this peaceful era in the Asia-Pacific region? Yeah,
certainly engagement throughout our lifetimes and throughout the whole of the Republic here has been important to us. And I think important to the global prosperity that has resulted, and peace as well. As I mentioned before, we're absolutely willing to engage with China. We engage with China routinely. I have as recently as last month. And we look forward to cooperating where we can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's why I think in your talk, the conclusions are very compelling. Mm-hmm. I think all of the conclusions which you reach, we should cooperate on North Korea, we should increase mill-to-mill contact, we should have better mill-to-mill contact. I mean, these are all compelling conclusions, even when I think the analysis is one which I would differ with. You talk about China engaging in a classic shell game of authoritarian dictators who trade nationalism for the lack of progress in a meaningful reform agenda. I've been living there on and off for 40 years, and I can tell you, even though in the last few years we may not have been seeing progress, the progress that we've seen in these 40 years is extraordinary. When I first lived there, I could not walk down the street without being followed by Ministry of Public Security people. Kids who graduated from college would be sent to places to work. Chinese couldn't travel. Now we have 350,000 of them in the United States. We have an economy that is majority private, not state-owned. So when we characterize China as failing on reform, I don't think we're doing ourselves any favors. Is it fair to characterize them that way?
Well, I think certainly the free and open international order that the United States has led over the course of the last 40 years has helped lift hundreds of millions out of poverty in China. I absolutely believe that is true. But when I look at the exercise of authoritarianism, the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in the Western China, where there's 1 million people in concentration camps right now, and I look at what's going on with the protest activity in Hong Kong, the rhetoric from China, President Xi and the party is quite alarming. They're calling people terrorists who look to me like they're only protesting for their civil liberties.
Yeah, fair points. I was surprised that the PACOM commander was opining on economic issues. I think it's a good thing, because I think obviously you're quite right that economic and security are now inextricably intertwined. But I noticed in one point it says, let me make sure I get it right, China's embraced an economic model dependent, and it's only in part, on currency manipulation. That's an interesting statement. It's just not supported by the economics anymore. That the IMF, the World Bank, international institutions don't agree on it. The U.S. Treasury rules, even though the U.S. Treasury has branded China currency manipulator, it doesn't qualify under those rules, because its ratio of current account surplus to GDP has moved from 10% to 0.03%. So how does that kind of figure?
Steve, I have to turn it back on you. Do they allow their currency to float like the U.S. allows the U.S. dollar to float? If it doesn't float like that, then it's being manipulated behind the scenes.
No, currency manipulation, I would argue, it's a term of art that the U.S. government Treasury regulations use, and when we branded China currency manipulator, we violated our own rules because one of those criteria, as I said, is this ratio of current account surplus to GDP, and it's gone from 10 to 3. We hosted the State Counselor, Foreign Minister Wang Yi last week for a dinner, and he says, "We hope the United States," and this is a quote from his speech to us, "we hope the United States will continue to play its due role of peace and prosperity, and we welcome it." How does that square with kind of the way we're thinking about China now, or the administration, or you were thinking about China now?
Well, President Trump announced a vision at the East Asia Summit in the fall of 2017 about a free and open Indo-Pacific. And I think fundamental to that free and open concept and the principles that support it is the objective of peace and prosperity for all. We would welcome China to that free and open international order, would like to see them take less pernicious activity in the region, whether it's in the information realm or the economic realm, be less threatening with their military forces in the South China Sea and East China Sea, and be a contributor to global security.
The free and open Indo-Pacific, how do countries like Vietnam or North Korea fit into it? Obviously, they are not free in any, don't share the values that we have.
Well, certainly North Korea is not a free state, Steve. And in fact, in the very shortest term, its most immediate threat to the security of its neighbors, certainly in the Indo-Pacific, and to the Indo-Pacific region writ large. And until we get the final fully verifiable denuclearization of North Korea, it'll remain the most immediate threat.
But how are we reaching out to Vietnam, which is also not free?
It's an area that I've traveled to myself here just in the last few months. I can tell you, traveling around Vietnam, there is energy. When you travel in the South, see the signage, all the vehicles, the cars, the businesses that are booming. It is an area and country that is coming to be a net contributor to the economic relationships across the region.
Last question, this decoupling that is being talked about from the perspective of PACOM, good, bad, neutral? The decoupling of the two economies, where we're seeing kind of separate ecosystems in the technology sphere, as you say, part of this is generated by information warfare that we feel it's necessary to have those, and obviously Huawei has played an important role in that.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that. I view the decoupling as a choice that China is actually making. What we're asking is for some safeties, in a free and open concept, that things like data won't be captured by the state and used for pernicious purposes writ large. So it's China is the one that's choosing decoupling in the economy.
What they, of course, argue is, increasing restrictions on Chinese investment, the temporary ban on ZTE, the current ban on Huawei, is precipitating the decoupling, not Chinese actions. But
thank you.
Well, this podcast has shown why you are the best and the brightest, and why it is such a pleasure to talk China with you. Yeah. Admiral, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Steve, for having me. And I appreciate the dialogue and the discussion. I look forward with the dialogue with all the members this evening.